It's none of their business that you have to learn how to write. Let them think you were born that way. Ernest Hemingway.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses.
I'm not a big fan of Ernest Hemingway, but I can get behind this quote.
It does tell us quite a bit about his mentality in writing, for sure. We have gone through this entire month talking about bits of bad writing advice that we have come across that we think is stuff that is either used out of context or just generally bad. Most of it we've tried to explain what the logic is, but it never comes across that way, like the kill your darlings and such. But of course, this month is only so long. You, as listeners, are going to be finding and coming across bad writing advice for the rest of your writing careers.
So today we are going to be talking about how you, as a writer who's going to get a bunch of advice, can identify the good from the bad. And more importantly, identify what is good for you and what is bad for you. Because all writing advice needs to be tailored to the writer.
Now, there are people out there who will say every bit of writing advice that you get is bad writing advice. To which I am a little insulted because we've spent 5+ years trying to give you good writing advice and give you the context in which this writing advice is applied.
But you do have to admit there is a sort of logic behind this idea that writing advice is always bad. And it starts with the idea that writing is an art, and that the point of that art is that it lacks rules. It is to push boundaries and break beyond what society has told us we can and can't do.
And another part of that logic is you have to find your own way of doing things. Just because Lee Hull says you have to do it this way doesn't mean that this is the only way to do something. Everyone finding their own approach to a thing is what gives them their unique flavor, their unique style, and their unique voice in the artistic world that they're dwelling in.
And then there is an element of all writing is good because it's yours. And we do say this a lot. Your first draft is good because it exists. Your writing is good because it exists and it is yours. So there is some merit to that statement, but it doesn't mean it's good in the sense of critics and readers and anything like that. But overall, we want you to follow this line of thought that rules are bad because it's more fun. We would rather have you break the rules than follow all writing advice that you find out there to a ridiculous degree.
We say, write selfishly, every episode, because we want you to trust yourself more than any other advice that you're getting. So if the options are follow 0 writing advice or follow all of the writing advice, following 0 is a better option. Of course, somewhere in between is going to be the best place to dwell.
And that best place is defined by you and what you need, what your writing needs, not by anybody else.
Something to consider when you are being given writing advice is that it's probably not being given maliciously. People are not saying, hey, avoid prologues just because they're mean and want you to fail. That's very rarely the case for every bit of writing advice you come across.
Most people who are taking time to give advice are trying to help you. They are trying to give you guidance, share their knowledge and their experience with you to help make your journey a little bit easier and a little bit better. That's what we do here. And we've vastly improved in the almost 5 years that we've been doing this. So really, anybody who's giving you advice is trying to help you, but they may or may not know everything, and you may or may not apply that advice correctly.
More often than not, the advice is just fine, it's just not meant for you. The advice that you absolutely must need an agent in order to get published is true if you are meeting a certain set of circumstances. You are wanting to get published with a Big 5 company. You are wanting to get traditionally published. you are wanting these things for your story, then yes, an agent is going to do a lot more good than harm for your career. So yes, get an agent if you qualify for all of these things. For me, that would be very misapplied because that doesn't apply to me. I don't want to be published by a Big Five company. I don't want to give up these controls that I have over my story. I want to be able to do things that traditional publishers won't let me do. So that advice does not apply to me, even if it's good advice for someone else.
So let's get really down to the point of this episode, and that is how you can identify bad writing advice. You can take all of the advice given out of the goodness of other writers' hearts and apply it correctly to your own writing. First of all, you have to consider the source of that advice.
If someone is a writing teacher and they became a teacher because they couldn't succeed at traditional publishing and you don't know anything that they've written, Elmore Leonard, who this month was brought to you by, the thing he's best known for is telling people how to write, not that his writing is very much like yours. My writing is nothing like Stephen King's, so I tend to buck against a lot of the advice that he has.
And it's not necessarily that they were successful authors, but do they have an otherwise successful career in publishing? Do they have a successful editing career, or are they part of the publishing world and have an insider knowledge into how it works? How are they, and why do they even know these rules in the first place? And then you also have to consider their genre, their role in the whole process, and whether or not that fits yours. I will probably take a lot more advice from Sanderson than any other author because that's the kind of writing I want to do.
If Tolkien came and read one of my manuscripts, one of my fantasy ones, and went, "Cool, you don't talk about trees enough," that is great. That is very much a difference between his style and mine. And Tolkien is a lot more famous than I am, so maybe I should take that advice, but I'm not going to. This is great advice for his writing. This is not great advice for my writing.
I just think of how his and C.S. Lewis's relationship must have been because their styles were so different and how they might have given each other advice that the other one just threw out the window because it didn't apply to them.
As I recall, their relationship almost came to blows because Lewis included Santa Claus, and Tolkien was not a fan of that particular fact.
But if Lewis had listened to Tolkien, another very successful author in a fantasy genre, then we wouldn't have the absolute fun ridiculousness that is the Chronicles of Narnia.
So the first thing to do when someone is giving you writing advice is consider the source. Do you trust them? Do they have experience? Are they sharing your target audience? Are they successful in their own right?
And then you have to look, does that advice even apply to you? And I think this one is what a lot of people run into when they are trying to balance all of their academic writing learning that they've had, the college essays or school writing reports or anything like that, where you learn a very specific style, usually MLA or some other academic style guide. And you have to throw all of that out because you're writing with a different style. You were writing in a space where you can suddenly use run-on and incomplete sentences, and you don't have to follow all of those rigid rules that you were taught in the years and years of school that you went through.
So a lot of the advice that you'll be getting and you'll be seeing are generally good indicators of growing pains, where you came from and your writing history compared to where you're going and where this project is headed. So those academic holdovers and habits that you have, the advice that you're given to counter those of avoid the prologues, avoid giving those detailed descriptions, avoid starting a paragraph talking about what the whole paragraph is going to be about, and then finishing the paragraph with a summation sentence, because that is an essay structure, that backpedaling that we talked about in November. These kinds of things are indicators of an academic style.
Another thing that you may find is when you see things more like a movie than a book, you're telling rather than showing. Even though you see it as a movie, you should be writing it more like a book.
It's just another growing pain where the person telling the story sees the image in their head because they're used to consuming media that is not necessarily the same as what they're creating. And that goes hand in hand with our next point. If you're not reading a lot because you don't want to contaminate your story or whatever, that's generally another indicator that you are growing as an author. You haven't fully matured into your own yet. Telling people to read, especially when I was first starting out, really annoyed me because a lot of traditional publishers would say, hey, you should be reading, which is generally good advice. And I took that as, hey, you should be buying my books, and they were trying to sell me something. This is not actually what the advice was going for, but this is how I misapplied it.
And a lot of these things that we're talking about just tell the reader that you're new and that you don't quite know how to use the tools. You don't quite know how to show or tell. You haven't broken away from your academic writing style. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a novice thing.
When I was in middle school, I was in band. I was actually in beginning band with one instrument and advanced band with a different instrument. Both of those instruments had reeds, which is a wooden slip that goes in your mouth that vibrates. And they have different thicknesses, and it was generally seen that the thicker the reed is, the more advanced player you are. Oh, you're playing on a 2.5? Well, I'm playing on a 3. That makes me a better player than you. As someone who has grown a lot past that, that is an understandable but ridiculous mentality. Because certain reeds that are shaved certain ways, that are different kinds of strengths, that are for different kinds of instruments, everyone has a purpose. If I am on my bassoon and I am playing on my high reed, the low notes are really difficult, and my middle range can be very easily knocked out of tune. So I don't generally play on the high reed unless I'm playing a high part. The same goes for recognizing if these rules apply to you. There is a maturity that comes with understanding your tools and understanding why this information has been given to you.
And that's really been a large point behind our entire month. It's not to tell you to follow or to break these rules, but to tell you to learn them, study them, get to understand them. Because if you understand the rules and why they exist in the first place, then you can decide whether or not it applies to you.
My alpha reader has always said that rules are for stupid people, which I don't necessarily agree with, but there is a nugget of truth in that sentiment, and that is that once you grow out of needing those rules, needing that structure, then you're going to follow them anyway. I don't stop myself from murdering the annoying next door neighbor because it's against the law. I stop myself from murdering them because it's the right thing to do. That rule does not apply to me, so I can kind of ignore it because I would obey it anyway.
It's much like when you're a kid and you just learn or you are told, stay away from bees. Don't go near them, don't aggravate them, stay away from the hive, don't bother them, they will come after you with a vengeance and it will hurt. But then you grow up and you get interested in bees and you learn to collect honey and become a beekeeper and you become friends with the bees and you have an understanding that yes, if you make them angry, they will come at you still, but you know how to not make them angry.
This doesn't invalidate the rule you were given as a kid. You've just grown out of it. So a lot of these rules, and this season, we are talking about how to grow out of these rules as much as we are saying, don't follow them.
So one thing we want you to keep an eye out for when you are trying to identify advice that will work for you or may not work for you is this one main point. Is that rule trying to change you? And is that change for the better or the worse?
Writing is about communication, and a lot of these very basic rules end a sentence with a period. That exists because if you don't, you're changing how you're communicating. A lot of these other style rules may or may not apply depending on if that's the style you want to write.
A lot of bad writing teachers will want you to write like them. I remember I had a teacher in high school that was, I believe, my civics class, and he would give you a bad grade if you didn't write exactly what he would have written. I was one of the few kids to get an A in his class because I knew how to mimic the style that he wanted. And it wasn't good, it wasn't better. You could have had the answer correct, but it was wrong because it wasn't written the way he wanted it to be written. And that is simply bad advice. That is a bad way to go about it, because style is what makes you an author. Just because it's not what the editor or the teacher would have done does not discount the merits of the word itself. I think this is a lot of why I'm trying to shift my own editing style to be more based around identifying the problems rather than offering solutions, which is a struggle for me because all of my editing in the journalistic world was just fixing it because there was no time.
A way to identify if this is happening to you is to notice the style that they are trying to offer and then deciding if that's what you want. So if someone has a very floral sense of writing and they tell you you're not talking about trees enough, decide, do I want to be talking about trees? If I am editing you, I assume we have this relationship because you want me to help you have a very lean and efficient way of communicating your story. That is understood in the relationship before we began. If you're trying to add words to your manuscript because it's too short, I am just not going to be the editor for you. Any of my advice as far as, hey, rephrase this and take out these words here in order to make it leaner and faster to read, it's not going to be helpful.
And this is generally why Lee and I are a good balance for each other when it comes to editing, because I can help her get descriptions and scene setting that would otherwise result in just a blank stage, while she can help me make sure I'm getting to the point.
You have a good pairing that way. We mix well because we're opposites.
Yeah. But it is an understanding that we had going into each other's style and editing and helping each other with writing. It is something you have to be aware of when you are learning from and taking advice from everybody. So if you take advice from Lee about making sure your story is quick and fast-paced, you have to understand she's coming from a background of action, adventure, thriller, not necessarily the purple prose associated with high fantasy.
And on the other side of this coin, don't try to make your writing style like somebody else's. That completely negates the motto. That negates what's really the only thing that you can bring to the scene. Yes, Brandon Sanderson is a very popular author. He is a great writer. He has a lot of good advice. Please do not write like Brandon Sanderson. You can follow the advice, but write like you.
And do not for a second think that you're a bad writer just because you don't write like Sanderson or Stephen King or any of the other innumerable bestseller authors out there. No one writes like you do, and that is a good thing.
We don't need more of them. They're working on that. We need more of you because that's new.
Especially Sanderson. He's definitely working on offering us more Sanderson. We don't need more.
Another way to recognize that this writing advice, this bad writing advice, is trying to change you, is that it's trying to censor you. There's a weird mentality going around, especially the author portions of Book Talk, that says you can't be successful both if you write the spicy stuff or the not spicy stuff. You need to write like this in order to do that. You can't do this. You can't have swear words in your book or else you won't be successful. That type of censorship means that it's generally not good writing advice. If you're writing middle grade, yeah, maybe don't include words that we would bleep out on this episode.
But when it comes to censorship and what you choose to put in your own book, it's your book. You get to choose what you want in it. If you don't want to write spicy scenes, don't write spicy scenes. There's a market for that. If you want to write spicy scenes, write them. There's a market for that. Don't listen to the first layer of Book Talk thinking that that's the only popular books that are out there. Something else that you do need to look out for with bad writing advice that is trying to change you is anything that is a absolute. All absolute statements are bad.
You'll see this often with people trying to change the plot of your book. So all self-inserts are terrible, which is something I was discussing with my mom actually over lunch today about how we hate self-inserts from the author, but every reader is self-inserting in some way. That's why spicy books are so popular. There should be a facet of self-insert with every single character. Connect with your characters. If you're saying never do this thing or always do this thing, that's going to generally be bad advice because there's always an exception to the rule.
This also applies to more than just characters. It can be any of the other rules that we had this month, especially the never open a book with blank. Only terrible books begin with weather. That's not true. Some really great books begin with weather because they focus on how that weather is affecting the character. They focus on the right things in association with that weather. Not all rules can just be blanket accepted across the board.
Another way bad advice will try to change you is they will try to change how you write, your writing routine. If you don't plot a book, it's going to be a terrible thing and it's going to be meandering and it's not going to have a good plot structure. You have to plot a book or else you won't get the book done.
Hard disagree, but also agree. Lee gives me a lot of crap about being a pantser, but I know it's in good fun and I know that she does it because she knows I can do better. I'm a pantser purely out of
spite.
Yeah. I should be a plotter, but I don't want to be. And that's okay. I don't have to become a full-blown plotter to write words, to get a story out there that's just as good as any.
Some people need deadlines. Some people completely ignore them. Lee, if she doesn't have a deadline, it's very easy for her to maybe write it tomorrow and play Baldur's Gate instead.
I have video games and I have chainmail to do and I have other crafting and I have to paint my room to make it all pretty. There are so many other things that I can do instead of write. And it's not that I don't like writing. It's just this other thing is shinier.
So deadlines are really helpful for Lee. I, on the other hand, don't trust the person who put the deadlines in front of me, and that person is me. So I just sort of go, that's nice. And I don't need the deadline in order to continue to write, to maintain that process. I just write at my own pace.
And you'll hear a lot of advice saying you have to write every day. That's how you keep the water flowing in your well of inspiration. But that's not necessarily true. You don't have to write every day. Sometimes you need time to recharge and think and contemplate and give your brain enough time to consider what words you're going to write, rather than just sit down and write everything.
Some people need 1,000 revisions. Some people don't like having any revisions. So the speed at which you release books, especially if you don't have a publisher breathing down your neck, is entirely up to you. There's no deadline on being a writer. You can be retired, you can be a teenager, it doesn't matter. And you don't have to publish one book a year in order to still wear the writer feather in your cap. If you're writing, you're a writer.
I think the most dangerous piece of advice that tries to change authors is the trend chasing advice. Well, this thing is really popular and it sells really well, so you should write that. Fourth Wing is flying off the shelf, so you should write about dragons too and make sure you include a lot of spice. No, that's not how that works. If you are trying to chase trends, you're always going to be behind them. So you should be writing whatever you want to write.
If you really want to sell, write something genuine. Write something that only you can write. Write something that is new, not something that someone else is doing. It's like, oh, well, you have to write this, otherwise you won't have a great career. That's opposite of what we are trying to tell you. If you are telling your story, no one else can tell it like you can. Do that instead of chasing these trends.
Nothing is a guarantee that your book is going to sell. And that is an unfortunate reality that we all have to face. Even if it hits all of those big trend points, it is not going to guarantee sales, because what matters far more is marketing. I've gone on a rant before about Red Tower and their marketing prowess, and that's really what sold Fourth Wing. Not its contents, not its fantastic writing, because it didn't have fantastic writing. It was the marketing. Just containing elements that people say are selling really well is not going to guarantee you anything. So it is better to write what you want to rather than what other people say is going to sell.
And in general, anyone who's saying you should write blank, the response should be, go ahead. You write that. What they want you to do is to put the work in so they don't have to, because the writing is the hard part, not the coming up with the ideas. So if they're saying, hey, you should make sure you include a mermaid in your story, but it's like a modern romance, doesn't include mermaids, I might do it as a joke. But anytime they say that, you can say, hey, you can definitely write that book. I encourage you to do it. Here's a podcast that has a lot of great advice about how to write a story. Go for it. Or you can point them toward a book that already has mermaids. Now, I will say, if you aren't a writer, you aren't someone who is pursuing a career in fiction, and someone says, hey, you should write about this experience that's unique to you. You should write this story that no one else can tell, because you don't want me, white girl Lee S's, writing about what it's like growing up Native American in this portion of the world. I'm not the person to be telling that story. But if someone is saying, hey, you are the person to tell this story, and you're writing mostly narrative nonfiction, then you can kind of consider it. But don't do it because they said it. Do it because you want to and you have your story to tell.
Overall, when trying to figure out good and bad advice, remember this one point. Don't take advice from someone you wouldn't take criticism from. If you don't think that their opinion on your story matters, then you don't need to take advice from them. I won't take criticism on my stories from somebody who only reads self-help nonfiction, because they don't know fantasy. They don't know what I'm trying to write. They don't even know the mystery parts that I'm working on. So I'm not going to take writing advice from them because it's probably not going to apply to my genre. However, I would gladly take criticism on my stories from Brandon Sanderson, so I'll listen to his advice. I will gladly take criticism from Lee on my stories, so I'll take her advice as well, with a grain of salt, just like I would take the criticism on my stories.
The biggest thing you can do with all of the advice we have given across the podcast, and especially across this month and this episode, is decide if those rules apply to you, and then develop your own rules. I happen to know that if I drink chamomile instead of rooibos, then I am not going to write nearly as interesting of a fight scene. That doesn't mean you can't drink chamomile when you are writing. That means this is the rule that works for me because I've experimented with different kinds of teas and I know what works and what doesn't.
And the best way to develop the rules that work for you is to understand the rules that are already out there. Understand the advice, learn it, learn from it, and then figure out what applies to you, or maybe how it applies to you.
And this is not a sit down on a Saturday afternoon and write down these lists that apply to you and that never changes again. Your list of rules that you develop for yourself, both taken from other bits of advice and ones that you've experimented with and figured out yourself, that list of rules will not only develop over time, but it will change over time. I used to pants the first act or so and then plot the other 2/3. Now I'm finding more and more that if I don't know how it ends, my first act is going to be a lot squishier and need a lot more editing. So I'm plotting a lot more than I used to.
Hey, me too.
It's the only way to write.
You have to give yourself the permission to change. When you are experimenting and figuring out the rules and which ones you like best, which ones apply best, you have to allow yourself over time to keep changing. I have to allow myself to be a little bit more of a plotter than I ever wanted to be. But that's because it gives me the structure that I really need to finish a story.
So create your own rules, figure out which ones apply, which ones don't. If your prologues are always boring, maybe the avoiding prologues is something that you need to have on your list, at least for now. And use breaking these rules as a writing prompt. Don't follow the rules of writing that are out there in the world. Follow your rules of writing, because that's what you've customized to you and how you keep your voice yours and keep your voice strong in your writing.
There is only ever one piece of advice you must unfailingly follow at all costs under penalty of death.
Write selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.